Path of Exile's 3.28 update is days away from being fully revealed, and we should be receiving the full patch notes immediately following the GGG live presentation on February 26th. Now in this video I'm going to be going over my predictions for 3 buffs and 3 nerfs for Path of Exile Mirage, beginning with the nerfs. And we're starting with the Genesis tree. Now, just a week ago or so, we learned that the Keepers of the Flame League mechanic, which is the revised version of Breach, will be going into the core game in 3.28, but there will be the normal list of changes that come with a mechanic going core. For example, Breach will no longer be present in every map by default, and there will be Breach-specific nodes related to the new version of Breach added to the Atlas passive tree, along with new Breach scarabs so that you can customize this content in your maps. The example that they provide in the post is that you will be able to specialize into the ability to control which type of Breach mechanics actually spawn in your maps. So if you hate those walls, you'll probably be able to prevent them from spawning if you want to. Now, predictably, Grafts will not be returning with the Breach addition to the core game, but the Genesis tree is going core, and if this post is anything to go by, the only thing that the tree will no longer be able to do is create grafts. So you'll still have the branches to be able to create equipment, uniques, and currency. And this has caused quite the discussion in the PoE community, because in regards to the Genesis tree creating equipment items using provisioning womb gifts, well, it's quite good at printing very good items. So much so that the 3.27 version of the Genesis tree largely invalidated a lot of ground loot extremely early in the campaign, and then later on in progression it often significantly devalued other crafting methods, because you can essentially skip a lot of them as the tree commonly rolls very high tier modifiers, and it often rolls them alongside other valuable modifiers as well. A good example of that is how good it is at crafting two-handed axes. Axes that are literally good enough to do all of the content in the game. Now, the post that details Breach 2.0 going core in 3.28 doesn't go into any detail at all regarding Graft Blood. Graft Blood was attached to, well, grafts, as it was stored in your grafts. But since grafts are going away in 3.28, we're not sure just yet how the Genesis tree will work. Will Graft Blood be a resource that's stored on your account like gold? Perhaps Graft Blood is going away entirely and you'll just be able to use the womb gifts directly if you have access to them. Whilst this information is unclear right now, we'll likely learn exactly how the Breach mechanic will be implemented during the livestream, but this is one of the methods that they could use to essentially nerf the tree. By increasing the Graft Blood costs to craft, or by making womb gifts rarer, or even by doing a bit of both, they can lower the amount of crafts you're able to create with the Genesis tree, which will nerf the amount of good items that the tree can put out. But I think the more likely change here is direct numerical adjustments to the Genesis tree nodes. For example, the nodes that add modifier tier rating, which eliminates lower tier modifiers, making it much more likely to receive those higher tier modifiers, or the nodes that roll chances for sockets and links, which in 3.27 led to players getting reliable 6 links as early as the second half of the campaign, which is probably a bit too soon. Either way, I expect that the Genesis tree in 3.28 will be quite a bit weaker than the 3.27 version, so that its core implementation doesn't devalue a bunch of pre-existing systems. Next up in the nerf predictions, it's Kinetic Blast and its transfigured version, Kinetic Blast of Clustering. Now, back prior to the launch of 3.27 Keepers of the Flame, it looks like this league was going to be the breakout release for a brand new skill, Kinetic Rain, a wand attack ability that looked almost too good to be true in the pre-release footage of the Ziggy D's gameplay. But it wasn't to be, because internally GGG had already nerfed the skill from the version that Ziggy had played on, and after the full 2020 Gems reveal post went live, players collectively decided that whilst 3.27 was still going to be Wand League, it certainly wasn't going to be Kinetic Rain League. Now, important to mention here is that Kinetic Blast was already one of the most well-performing skills in the previous league, 3.26 Mercenaries. By the time that league came to a close, 8% of character builds level 95 or higher in softcore trade were using KB. and it was only just beaten in terms of play rate by Forbidden Rite of Soul Sacrifice, a build that was heavily nerfed in 3.27. But KB remained, and not only did it remain, but it thrived. The strength of this skill translated league to league, and the Keepers of the Flame update bolstered the wand attack archetype with a few new additions, including new wand bases that cannot roll caster modifiers, which are especially helpful to enable wand crafting through early progression. But there's also the transfigured version of this skill, Kinetic Blast of Clustering. That wasn't even close to as popular as the base version in the previous league, 3.26. In fact, this build was only being played on 0.6% of characters level 95 or higher compared to the 8% of regular KB. However, the potential was there, and with Kinetic Blast of Clustering receiving a buff for about 17% more damage in the patch notes, the stars were aligning for this skill to absolutely dominate the league, and that's exactly what it did. Kinetic Blast of Clustering is the most played skill in 3.27 softcore trade for builds level 95 or higher. And I think it's very likely that we'll see numerical adjustments to both variants of KB come 3.28. Now, onto my third and final nerf prediction for this video is Foulborn Hand of Thought and Motion. One thing to mention here is that Foulborn items have not been explicitly mentioned by GGG in the post about Breach 2.0 going core, but since it was mentioned that Graphs wouldn't be making a return, I think we can infer that Foulborns are sticking around as part of Breach 2.0's core implementation into Path of Exile, especially considering they pretty much make up the exclusive reward component for this league mechanic. And if Foulborns are intended to go core as expected, then Foulborn Hand of Thought and Motion has to be at the top of the list when it comes to uniques that need to be adjusted moving forward. This item enabled one of the strongest builds in 3.27 due to the increased accuracy rating per intelligence Foulborn modifier. That one just combines way too well with the Juggernaut's undeniable Ascendancy Notable and the Storm Rider boot space for huge flat damage and attack speed scaling. These builds were absurd, often with massive amounts of energy shield from natural intelligence stacking scaling, and millions or even billions of damage per second, easily one of the most broken builds in recent Path of Exile leagues. There's not really too much to say about this item. It will either receive a large numerical nerf to the Foulborn modifier, or I think more likely than that, the modifier will be replaced with something else in 3.28 and beyond. Okay, let's move on to the buff predictions for Path of Exile Mirage, and we're starting with loot. Now that might sound like a particularly vague buff prediction, but that's exactly what I expect for 3.28. Changes to improve loot in terms of basic ground drops and endgame farming strategies. The feel of loot in 3.27 was quite bad to say the least. The combination of several targeted nerfs to endgame farming strategies, with the existence of breach walls in about half of the maps, it didn't feel great to progress through those areas in Keepers of the Flame, and part of that was the lack of generic loot drops. The breach mechanic itself feels like it dialed back on loot compared to the original version, and normal monsters seem to be dropping less as well. However, this has been a problem for much longer than just 3.27. For example, back in Settlers, the majority of my divines came from just clicking shipments. And when I say the majority, I mean like 95% or more of my divines in that league. And this didn't change with the core implementation of King's March either. If and when I need raw divines, I know that I can rely on shipments much more than I can in general mapping. Now, I do want to recommend a very good video by Snap from just a few days ago, where he outlines the historical changes that have led to the situation of loot in Path of Exile in the present day. That one has a ton of great information to get you up to speed with how we got here, and I'll also link Fubgun's video too, which highlights some of the more recent changes to loot in the last 3 or 4 leagues that have had quite a large impact on endgame farming strategies. Both of those videos are worth a watch, and they go into far more detail on the topic. But considering GGG themselves said that they plan to make bigger changes to farming strategies in 3.28, I expect to see some big improvements in this area come launch. Up next in the buff predictions, it's Tier 17 maps. Now technically, this could be a buff or nerf prediction depending on how you want to look at it, but I'll call it a buff prediction because I expect GGG to simply improve tier 17s as far as their original design concept goes. I went into a lot of detail about tier 17s in a previous video for why these changes should be coming in the upcoming league, but essentially tier 17s never really ended up being what they wanted them to be, which was a stepping stone from normal pinnacles to uber pinnacle bosses, but that simply isn't what they are in current PoE. Instead, they've replaced tier 16 maps in some of the most efficient endgame farms, which is something that they said they didn't want, and this was a result of several changes back in 3.24 that added a lot of extra loot to these maps in the form of modifier bonuses to quantity, rarity, currency, and more. But beyond that, tier 17s have also caused some of the most restrictive gameplay that the game has ever seen due to incredibly oppressive map modifiers. This has led to a select few ascendancies and archetypes reigning supreme for many leagues in a row, as they've been able to essentially ignore several modifiers, such as the Trickster with the action speed modifiers on tier 17s. Now, with all of that said, GGG are aware of these problems. In fact, in several interviews in the past, they've acknowledged that tier 17s aren't in a good spot. But it wasn't until the 3.27 Q&A that they really got into this topic in much more detail, and I think we're going to see big changes to this issue sooner rather than later. Let's move on to my final buff prediction for 3.28, which is underused ascendancies. Now, we've already had that very brief and cryptic teaser with the Scavenger Scion Ascendancy from Freesia, which looks like it might make its way into the core game in some shape or form, but I think this is going to extend a bit further with improvements to other ascendancies as well. The Guardian has consistently been one of the least popular ascendancies for many leagues in a row, and this Templar Ascendancy suffers from having a bunch of lackluster options alongside a few solid ones. In theory then, the addition of Bloodline classes should have solved this issue, as they provide a lot more options to replace those weaker choices, but the Guardian found itself at the bottom of Ascendancy share in 3.27 in softcore trade, at just 0.6% of level 95 and higher characters, and even in hardcore leagues where this Ascendancy is generally a bit more favourable, it still only represents about 2% of characters in hardcore trade and just 1% in HC SSF. There's also the Saboteur, with the rework in 3.21 that just never really caught on. In a way, this Ascendancy suffers from the same problems as the Guardian. It has a few very good notables that can reasonably make their way into a diverse set of builds, but the other choices are just incredibly niche. Both the Saboteur and the Guardian could use some improvements, and I think we could see that come to fruition in 3.28. And there you have it. My predictions for 3 buffs and 3 nerfs for Path of Exile 3.28 Mirage. And we don't have long to wait now for the full reveal, and hopefully the patch notes right after that. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.